Why do I like fat loss sprints? The longer a fat loss phase goes, the lower adherence becomes. But if I know that I'm just going to do 2 to 4 weeks of fat loss before I have a diet break, it's a lot more encouraging. And by being able to go aggressive during that time, I get to see results much faster during that period of time, and that is also encouraging. And you can afford to be more aggressive when you're doing short fat loss phases because it's not a sustained deficit and because it takes a longer period of time to start to really see those losses of lean mass. So adherence is a big reason why I like it. It's more encouraging because you get to see weight loss results pretty quickly because you're having a steeper deficit. You get to see some quick results, but it's balanced by also having diet breaks at maintenance. I also like it because of the psychological aspect of when it starts to get hard, you can look at it and say, well, I've only got to do this for 14 days or 20 days. It's not that hard. Okay, I'm feeling hungry, this and that, but I've got a diet break 5 days from now, or I've got a diet break 10 days from now. And you can still do this while incorporating some higher calorie days, doing calorie cycling within those fat loss sprints, which is exactly what I do. Most people get thrown off track from their fat loss goals when events pop up, or there's travel involved, or stress, those sorts of things. But with this, you can actually program around the times that you'll know you'll have time and can make it a focus. So I really like fat loss sprints for those reasons. What I do is, again, 2 to 4 week sprints of fat loss where I'm in a pretty aggressive deficit. And then I do anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks at maintenance typically. I might go a little bit longer if it's in something like the holidays and I don't really feel like dieting and New Year's, that sort of thing. But generally, my diet breaks at maintenance will last about 1 to 2 weeks.
If you're expecting the workouts and training to really, really suck, the diet to really suck, then, like day 15, you're going to be like, yeah, like it's going fine based on how I expected. If you think, oh, I've done fitness challenges before, I'll just eat a little bit less, do a bit more, it's not going to cut it. It's going to be brutal. So first, for diet, in protein, you eat your body weight in pounds and grams of protein. So if you ate 200 pounds, you eat 200 grams a day. Very straightforward. For carbs, you keep them minimal, which is to say 5 to 10 grams per meal. Okay, that sucks. And all of it usually in veggies. So green veggies especially, the amount of fullness they give you and the amount of micronutrients they give you for how few calories they have is the best of all the foods. So it's just going to be lean meat and steamed or grilled or fresh, raw, mostly greens. That a total of 10 grams of carbs if you subtract out the fiber, which is a lot of greens, but you'll need them because you'll be starving to death. Fats are traced from proteins. That means you can even eat things like salmon, pretty fatty proteins. I wouldn't eat like pork sausage or anything. Keep them bodybuilding-esque foods, but you can eat even slightly fattier meats as long as you keep those carbs to 5 to 10 per meal and veggies. Trace fats come along. My recommendation is to do 4 meals because the meals are bigger. You can get fuller from them and have more of a psychological satiety. My next recommendation is to have the first meal 3 hours after you wake up to push more of the food towards the evening so that you can have your last meal just before bed, not be ultra hungry between meals. And because you'll have your last meal just before bed, it satiates you just enough to let you go to sleep because sleep is critical and you may be in a position where sleep is very difficult to get because you're at such a huge deficit. Your body's starving on all systems. It's going to wake you up. It's going to prevent you from going to sleep. It's going to make you hungry. This doesn't solve the problem, but it mitigates it to the extent possible given the magnitude of the caloric deficit.
I'm a pretty big fan of incorporating protein-sparing modified fast days, which is basically what Mike said. You add the protein and essential nutrients to fuel overall health and ward off muscle loss. Because a lot of people don't realize that if you don't eat at all and you add protein, you'll actually lose more fat generally. Because what the protein does, it's up until your requirements, which is at least 1.6 gram per kilogram per day for most people. That protein is used for protein synthesis. It's preferentially used for that by the body. It won't be used as energy, it won't be oxidized, and it won't be stored as fat. So it's basically free calories in that sense. Not only that, but that protein synthesis and those metabolic processes that the protein consumption feeds, those increase energy expenditure. So you end up with a higher total energy expenditure and no additional substrate used for either energy usage or fat gain. So you actually end up losing more fat if you only eat protein versus if you eat nothing at all. On top of that, you ward off muscle loss and potentially even gain it. So it's basically a win-win on every single front.
Your weight training, 5 to 6 days per week of weights. Because you want to present that best physique, you got to put as much throughput into the muscles, catabolism and anabolism as possible. Okay, you train twice a week, you look fine. You train 5 to 6 days a week for, 6 weeks, you're going to look pretty cool at the end, right? Not pounds and pounds of muscle, but maybe a few. And maybe you can hope to retain all of your muscle with this training volume. And if you retain all of your muscle while losing 8 to 12 pounds of fat, gee whiz, that's notable. That's definitely notable. You want to do full body? Or a more technical way is you want to train every muscle you want to keep. So if you just don't care, I don't care about my calves. If they get way smaller during this, who gives a shit? You don't have to train your calves. But every muscle you want to stay a similar size and not shrink down and be pathetic, then you train that muscle. So usually it's full body. High volume, generally, you're pushing the limits because you want the most throughput possible. High volume training not only builds the most muscle, it breaks down the most muscle and requires the most calories to repair. So if you do relatively high volume training, then your total amount of body change is very high, both on the fat burning end and the muscle building end. We want to maximize that, right? 1 to 3 reps in reserve, generally. We're going pretty close to failure. This is hard training. Short rest intervals are just fine for efficiency. So if you don't want to spend all day in the gym, you can do compound antagonistic supersets, like a set of pull-ups, set of bench, set of pull-ups, set of bench, set of squats, set of upright rows, set of squats, set of upright rows, shit like that. It's awful, it's brutal, but it'll do the job. And what you want to do is try to match or beat your reps and or load by tiny amounts, but your goal is just not to get weaker. So if you can be the same strength in week 1 and the same strength in week 5 right before you peak, you really won. Because the amount of imposed short-term acute fatigue through that paradigm is so high that you probably gained muscle if you just kept your performance the same. If your performance fell by a little bit, you probably just kept muscle. If it falls by a ton, then you probably lost muscle, and that does not contribute to the best look possible. So push it hard. Desperately try to cling onto your performance. And the sets generally are composed of 10 to 30 reps each. Anywhere between there is good. Sets of 5 to 10 are fine, but they tend to, in the short term, cause a pretty decent level of systemic fatigue for not as much caloric throughput. And sets of 5 just don't burn as many calories. And here we're trying to burn so many calories that your weight training workouts, as illustrated by the short rest intervals being okay, they double as caloric burn workouts. So sets of 10 to 30 reps will be brutal, especially if you do it in superset style. But boy, oh boy, will that burn a whole lot of calories for you and helps on the other side of the equation. All right, that's how you do the thing. You notice it's really just one mesocycle's worth of instruction because it's just one mesocycle that you can pull this off.
What is zone 2 exercise? It is a cellular definition, which is the highest level of energy you can put out while keeping lactate below 2 millimolar, which is not a very high amount. Certainly higher than you are at rest, but nowhere near what you would be exerting when you do an all-out effort. You have sort of exceeded the threshold of the mitochondria to stay in an equilibrium where it can clear the amount of lactate it produces. So that's how I define zone 2. And when I say I do, I don't mean that this is my definition. I'm saying that's the definition that I use personally and with my patients. I prefer to do all of my zone 2 on a bike. And the reason for that is on a bike, you have watts. Watts are the ultimate metric of output, which is not to say you can't be just as precise when you're using a treadmill. I like to really think about everything in watts per kilo. So how many watts am I generating divided by my mass in kilos? And when you look at really, really unhealthy people who are metabolically very sick, they would have a zone 2 threshold, meaning they exceed that 2 millimole probably by the time they're at 1 watt per kilo of activity. Conversely, when you look at the absolute fittest of the fit, so if you look at professional cyclists who would be about as fit as any athlete could possibly be, they're actually going to be closer to about 4 watts per kilo in terms of how much work their bodies can do while still keeping lactate below 2 millimole.
The average UK male walking at the average walking speed on a flat surface for 1 hour will burn about 320 calories. Since the low impact and low intensity nature of it won't risk interfering whatsoever with your recovery. So I should mention tracking those steps. Most phones these days have an inbuilt pedometer. There are also a lot of smart watches that track your steps, which might be a little more accurate. You could do half an hour in the morning, 15 minutes at lunch, and half an hour in the evening.